The night was unnaturally still. Not a single whisper of wind disturbed the trees that lined the old Hollowbrook road. It had been years since anyone in the village had spoken of it, and for good reason. Hollowbrook was a name forgotten by most, a place best left undisturbed. But for those who knew its story, those who had survived, Hollowbrook wasn't a place, it was a warning. Kayla had heard the rumors, the hushed voices in the town pub, the strange look in her aunt's eyes when the subject came up. But rumors were just that, stories people told to spice up their dull lives. She hadn't believed them. Not until she found herself at the crossroads, standing before the decaying sign that read, Hollowbrook Road. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold wind, though it wasn't the wind that made her shiver. It was something far worse, a strange, invisible pull toward the road. The dense trees seemed to lean in, casting eerie shadows that flickered in the corner of her vision. Kayla's mind raced. She was only passing through just a short detour on her way to see her aunt in the next town. She didn't need to stop, didn't need to. Something moved in the trees. She froze. The wind had picked up, but the rustling in the branches was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was almost like footsteps. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her instincts screamed at her to turn around. But she didn't. She couldn't. The pull was stronger now. The road seemed to beckon her forward. She glanced at her phone. No service. Of course. It was as if the place had been deliberately erased from the modern world, hidden in some forgotten corner. Kayla sighed, annoyed at her own curiosity. She stepped onto the dirt road. The further she walked, the heavier the air grew, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The trees were dense here, their twisted branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the fading daylight. The path ahead was narrow and uneven, overgrown with wild brambles and weeds. Every step she took felt like a step back in time, like the road had been waiting for her for years. She heard it again, those footsteps. But this time, they were closer. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but the road was empty. The oppressive silence returned, thick and suffocating. She wiped her damp palms on her jeans, trying to steady herself. Maybe it was just an animal, some small creature scurrying through the brush. But that didn't explain the smell. There was a faint odor in the air, something damp, almost musty, like mildew or decaying wood. It made her stomach churn. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. No response. Just the whispering wind through the branches. She moved forward, her feet dragging through the overgrown underbrush. The trees seemed to close in on her, and the shadows grew deeper. It was as if the road itself didn't want her to leave. Each step she took, the world around her grew darker, colder, and then she saw it. A house, old, decaying, and shrouded in mist. It stood at the end of the road, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. The windows were shattered, and the roof sagged under the weight of years. This wasn't just any house. This was the place the villagers whispered about, the Hollowbrook House. Kayla's pulse quickened. The air around her grew even colder, and for a moment, she considered turning back. But something compelled her to move forward, the need for answers outweighing the fear gnawing at her. She reached the steps of the porch. The door was ajar, creaking softly, as though it had been waiting for her to arrive. Kayla stepped over the threshold. The house was deathly quiet, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. The musty smell was stronger here, mixed with the faint scent of old paper and something metallic, like rust. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what might lie inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she explored the front room. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the faintest draft. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something, someone, was waiting for her to make a mistake. A sudden, sharp sound echoed through the house. It was a thud, like something heavy dropping to the floor. Kayla froze, her hand gripping the doorframe as her heart leaped into her throat. She wasn't alone. Kayla's breath caught in her throat as the thud reverberated through the house. The sound was so sudden, so out of place that for a moment she questioned her senses. Her mind raced. Was it just the house settling? A rat, perhaps? But the air felt thick with anticipation, charged with a presence she couldn't explain. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn around and leave, but her feet were frozen to the floor. She couldn't look away from the darkened hallway that stretched before her, the shadows in the corners seeming to move with a life of their own. A cold gust of air swept through the room, lifting her hair, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something. A figure, faint but unmistakable, standing at the end of the hall. "Hello?" Kayla's voice trembled, but it felt like it wasn't hers at all. It was as though the house was speaking through her, drawing her in deeper. There was no reply. With slow, deliberate steps, she moved forward, her fingers brushing the walls as she walked. They were damp to the touch, the wood rotting beneath her hand. The further she walked down the hallway, the louder the silence grew. Oppressive, suffocating. The portraits on the walls felt too lifelike, their eyes piercing her soul. Each frame contained a different family member, strangely lifeless faces staring back at her, their painted eyes flickering with a malevolent gleam. The thud echoed again, closer this time. It came from behind her. Kayla spun around, heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. "Who's there?" she called out, but the house swallowed her words, leaving only the creaking sound of the floorboards and the whisper of wind through the broken windows. A low, guttural noise came from the shadows at the far end of the hall. It wasn't human. It sounded almost animalistic, like something was dragging itself across the floor. Kayla's blood ran cold. She turned to leave, but something held her in place. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythmic beat, as though the house itself was alive, breathing. She stepped backward, but her foot hit something solid, a step. She turned to see a narrow staircase leading upward, spiraling into darkness. The feeling that she wasn't alone intensified as a faint whisper reached her ears, so faint it might have been a figment of her imagination. "Come, closer." The voice was soft, like a beckoning, like a lullaby for the damned. It was gentle but filled with a deep, unnatural hunger that made her skin crawl. Kayla swallowed hard. She had to know. Whatever this was, whatever had been pulling her in, she couldn't leave without understanding it. Slowly, she took a step toward the stairs, then another, each movement feeling more unnatural than the last. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step groaning as though protesting her ascent. The higher she climbed, the darker it became. The dim light from the hallway below barely reached the top, casting long, terrifying shadows on the walls. She could feel something up there, a presence waiting. At the top of the stairs was a door, slightly ajar, with an old tarnished handle. It looked ancient, the wood warped and cracked with age. Something about it felt wrong. Wrong in a way that made every instinct in her body scream at her to turn back. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had led her here. Kayla pushed the door open. The room inside was small, cramped, but its contents were far more unnerving than its size. It was filled with mirrors, large, old mirrors, their surfaces streaked with a thin layer of dust. The reflections were distorted, the glass cracked in places, but they reflected her image in ways she couldn't explain. The mirrors didn't show her exactly as she was standing. They twisted her features, bending them into grotesque shapes, and then she saw it. In the corner of one mirror, almost hidden in the shadows, was another figure. It was not hers. The figure was tall, thin and unnaturally still. Its face was obscured, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching. She spun around, her heart racing, but the room was empty. No figure. Only the faint sound of her own breathing and the slow, steady creak of the house settling. She turned back to the mirrors. The figure was there again, this time closer. Its hands were outstretched, the fingers long and unnaturally thin, reaching for her. Kayla staggered backward, bumping into the door. Her breath was shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't just a house. It was something more. Something ancient. Something alive. A crackling sound broke the silence. The mirrors shimmered, their surfaces warping as though they were being drawn into another dimension. And then, through the glass, she saw something else. A hallway, not the one she had just come from, but another one entirely. It stretched endlessly into the blackness, and at the end of that hallway, there was a door. A door that beckoned her forward. The whisper came again. Come. Closer. Kayla stumbled toward the mirror, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the cold surface. Her reflection shifted, her own image smiling back at her. But it wasn't her smile. It was the figure's smile, stretching too wide, too unnaturally. No, Kayla whispered, her hand recoiling from the mirror. The smile in the glass twisted into something darker, and then the figure stepped forward. The moment the figure crossed the threshold of the mirror, the air in the room thickened. The temperature dropped, and Kayla could see her breath form in front of her in misty clouds. She took a step back, but the figure followed, its form growing clearer with every passing second. It was no longer just a shadow in the glass. Now it was real, and it was standing right in front of her. Its face was gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The more Kayla looked at it, the more she felt her own heartbeat slowing, like the presence in the room was stealing her life force. The figure lifted its hand toward her, its fingers curling into claws. Kayla stumbled back, but the room seemed to close in on her. The walls shifted, moving with the sound of grinding stone. The mirrors surrounding her pulsed, their reflections warping as the figure advanced. "Help! Help me!" A voice rasped, a hollow, mournful sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was no longer just the figure's voice. It was the house itself, the walls, the mirrors. They were alive, whispering in unison. Kayla turned and ran, her heart slamming against her chest. The door was just ahead, but as she reached for the handle, a cold hand gripped her wrist. It was so cold it felt like death itself had touched her. She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the lingering echo of a voice that wasn't hers, her own voice, distorted and muffled by the house's presence. "You should never have come," it whispered. The door slammed shut. Kayla's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to pull the door open. It was no use. The handle wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had sealed her in, trapping her in this nightmare. Her pulse raced and her hands shook violently as she tried again. "Let me out!" she screamed, slamming her fists against the door. But the house was silent, save for the low hum that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. She could feel it now, its presence, lurking just behind her, watching, waiting for the moment when she would break. The walls around her groaned as if alive, shifting and creaking in a language older than the house itself. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being surrounded by something, some force, some entity that had been here long before her arrival. She stepped back from the door, her eyes scanning the room. The mirrors had returned to their distorted reflections, their glassy surfaces now cracked and jagged. But something was different. The room was no longer static. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and sway, as though they were alive. Figures, vague and shifting, emerged from the darkness. Faces, hundreds of them. They were blurred at first, but then slowly, they came into focus. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at her with an unsettling hunger. Kayla's heart froze in her chest. These weren't reflections. These were people. Real, once living people. Or perhaps they had been, long ago. She backed away, her breath quickening. These were the lost souls of Hollowbrook, the ones who had never left. Their hollow eyes followed her every movement as she looked around, desperately searching for a way out. "Who are you?" Kayla whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Instead, the figures began to murmur, their voices overlapping like a chorus of whispers. She came back. Too late now. She must pay the price. Help us." The words were disjointed, fragmented, but they were enough. Kayla's mind raced. These voices, were they the ones responsible for her being here? Were they calling to her? Did they know something about the horrors that had happened in this house? A flicker of movement caught her eye. One of the figures in the mirror stepped forward, emerging into the room. The others parted like a sea, giving it space. This one was different from the others. Its face was familiar, yet strange. It was a woman, young, with dark hair and a pale, ethereal complexion. Kayla took a hesitant step toward her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" Kayla asked again, her voice barely a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, though her eyes remained empty, devoid of emotion. "You know who I am," she said, her voice soft but filled with an otherworldly power. Kayla's stomach churned. "No, I don't." The woman's smile deepened, and for a moment, Kayla could see the faintest glimmer of recognition in her eyes. "You should. You've heard the stories, haven't you? The stories of Hollowbrook, of those who never left." Kayla felt a chill slide down her spine. The village, the disappearances. The woman nodded. "Yes, Hollowbrook was never just a road. It was a place, a threshold. Those who came here, those who ventured too far, were never meant to leave. We were trapped here, just like you." Kayla's mind spun. "What do you mean? What happened to you?" The woman's gaze turned dark, her smile fading into something far more sinister. "It was the house. It was hungry. It fed on us, our lives, our souls. It took us, piece by piece, until we couldn't remember who we were or where we had come from." Kayla's throat tightened as she stepped back, her pulse quickening. "And now you want me to stay?" The woman's form flickered, her figure distorting like a reflection in water. "Not want, need. You are the last, the final piece." Before Kayla could respond, the room began to shake. The mirrors cracked wider, their shards falling to the floor like glass rain. The figures in the room howled, their faces contorting in agony as the house itself seemed to come alive, its walls groaning, its floors vibrating beneath her feet. Kayla screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony of tortured souls. She spun around, searching for an escape, but the door she had just tried to open, was gone. In its place, a new passage had appeared, leading deeper into the house. A dark hallway, lined with more mirrors, each one reflecting something different. The woman's voice echoed in her mind. "You can never leave. Not now. Not after you've seen the truth." The air in the hallway was thick with the stench of mildew and decay. Kayla stepped forward cautiously, her shoes crunching on the broken glass from the shattered mirrors. The walls around her seemed to pulse with each step she took, as though the house itself was alive, breathing with a rhythm that matched her own frantic heartbeat. Her hands were trembling as she reached out to touch the nearest mirror, but as her fingers brushed the surface, a jolt of electricity shot through her, sending her stumbling backward. She gasped, her chest heaving with panic. The mirror had responded to her touch. She could feel it, feel the strange power in the glass. The house was alive. Her eyes flicked to the end of the hallway where another door stood. This one closed tightly, its surface smooth and black like the void. It beckoned her forward. There was no other choice. She had to know what lay behind it. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she could escape, but deep down, she knew it was pointless. This place, this cursed house, had already chosen her. She was part of its story now. Kayla walked down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The mirrors along the walls seemed to shift and bend, showing images that weren't her own. Faces, endless faces. She saw the woman from before, her eyes now wild, screaming in silent agony. She saw children, small, twisted children with hollow eyes, reaching out to her from the glass. When Kayla reached the door, her hand trembled as she grasped the cold iron handle. She twisted it slowly, the door creaking open with an ominous groan. Inside, the room was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. At the center of the room was a large, blackened stone altar, surrounded by faded candles and strange symbols etched into the floor. The air was thick with the smell of incense, a pungent, sickly sweet aroma that made her head spin. On the altar lay a body. Kayla gasped, stepping closer. It was a man. His face was pale, his features twisted in an expression of pure terror. His eyes were wide open, but they were empty, lifeless. But then, the body twitched. Kayla's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, heart racing. The man's eyes snapped open, and for a moment she could see the pain and terror that had consumed him. But then, his lips parted, and he whispered the one word that froze her blood. "Run." Before she could react, the walls of the room began to close in. The mirrors surrounding her shattered, sending shards of glass flying. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder, more frantic. "Run, Kayla. Run." But it was too late. The house was already claiming her. Kayla's fight for survival has now become a race against time. The house is closing in, and the spirits trapped inside have turned their focus to her. What happens next? We can explore the dark rituals that bind the house, or delve into Kayla's desperate attempt to escape with whatever power she can muster. Kayla's heart hammered in her chest as the walls of the room closed in around her. The air was thick, stifling, with the scent of something rotten, something ancient. The mirrors on the walls shattered in a rain of jagged glass, the shards reflecting countless twisted faces that seemed to leer at her from every direction. The figure of the man on the altar, his mouth moving, muttered the same word over and over again, "Run." But Kayla could feel it now, the pull of the house, dragging her deeper into its suffocating embrace. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices blending into a maddening cacophony that echoed in her skull. "Run, Kayla. Escape. Or stay forever." But Kayla was trapped. The door had vanished again, and there was nowhere to go. Every direction led to darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed from the far corner of the room. She spun toward the noise, and from the shadows emerged a new figure. It was no longer human. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, its body covered in what looked like pale, translucent skin that barely clung to its skeletal frame. The creature's eyes were black voids, empty of light, but they fixed on her with terrifying intensity. "No, please." The words barely escaped her lips as the creature approached, its long, clawed fingers scraping across the stone floor. Each movement it made seemed to suck the warmth from the room, leaving only a frozen chill in its wake. Kayla stumbled back, her hands bracing against the cold altar. "You have seen too much," the creature whispered, its voice a hiss that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "The house has claimed you. You cannot leave." Kayla's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. She tried to push herself away, but her hands trembled, slipping on the wet stone. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls shifting and twisting like a living thing. The creature took another step forward, and with that step, the temperature dropped even further. Kayla could feel the chill gnawing at her bones. It was as if she were being drawn into the very essence of the house itself. "No, I won't stay here. I won't become like them." Her voice cracked, desperation creeping into her words. The creature's eyes flickered with something like amusement. It was as if it knew something she didn't. "You already are," it crooned. "The house doesn't take lives, Kayla. It takes souls." Kayla's mind reeled. Souls. She felt as though the weight of the house itself was pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish. She could barely keep her eyes open as the creature continued its slow advance. "Why me?" she whispered, struggling to find her voice. "Wait, why am I here?" The creature tilted its head, a terrible grin spreading across its face. "The house chose you long ago, Kayla, long before you ever stepped foot on Hollowbrook Road. It watches, waits, and when the time is right, it calls." Suddenly the room seemed to shift again, and Kayla felt herself being pulled, not by the creature but by something far more powerful, something she couldn't see. It was as though the house itself was trying to claim her, wrapping her in its dark tendrils. Her vision blurred as the creature's voice grew louder in her ears, more urgent. "You're already part of the house. You always were. You just didn't know it." With a final, desperate effort, Kayla forced her feet to move. She stumbled toward the altar, grabbing the body of the man lying on it. His skin was cold, lifeless, but his eyes were still open, staring at her with that same horrified expression. "Help me," she whispered, but the man didn't answer. Then, the whispering voices intensified, rising to a deafening roar. The walls of the room began to close in on her, and the floor beneath her feet cracked, sending tremors through the house. The house was alive in a way that no human mind could fully comprehend. The man's mouth moved, ever so slightly, as if trying to speak, but the words were lost in the madness of the house. Kayla's heart pounded in her chest as the walls seemed to breathe around her. She realized with a sickening sense of horror that the house wasn't just trapping her, it was feeding off her fear, her confusion, her very soul. "No, I won't let you take me," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. But the house did not listen. The walls groaned as the house shifted again. The mirrors, now shattered, lay scattered across the floor, reflecting nothing but shadows. The creature that had stalked her moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its eyes gleaming with malice. Kayla's mind raced, her thoughts like a whirlwind. There has to be a way out. There has to be something I can do. Then she remembered the door that had been at the end of the hallway before it disappeared, the one she had been drawn to, the one that had been calling to her. Could it be the way out? Or was it another trap? With renewed resolve, Kayla pushed past the creature, ignoring the cold touch of its clawed hand that reached for her. She ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted down the dark corridor. The house seemed to fight her every step, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she reached the end of the hallway, the door loomed in front of her. It was not a door at all, but a passageway, a dark, hollow tunnel that seemed to stretch infinitely into the blackness. Kayla stepped forward, her heart racing, but the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt something shift in the air. It was as if the house itself had recognized her, and it wasn't going to let her go that easily. The moment she stepped into the tunnel, the walls closed behind her with a deafening roar. She was plunged into darkness, the air thick with a coldness that cut straight through to her bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled forward, her mind racing. What am I supposed to do? In the distance, she saw a faint light, flickering, uncertain, but it was enough. She ran toward it, hoping it was the way out, hoping it was her escape. But as she drew closer, she realized the light wasn't the answer. It was the beginning of something far worse. At the center of the tunnel stood a figure, tall, dark, and ancient, its face hidden in shadows. It held something in its hands, a book, worn and ancient, its pages yellowed with age. It spoke, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the darkness. "You are the last," it said, "the last to complete the ritual, the last to pay the price." Kayla stopped in her tracks. "What ritual?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure lifted the book, and the air around them seemed to pulse with dark energy. "The ritual that binds this house, the ritual that binds you." Kayla's heart raced as she stared at the figure in front of her, its presence an overwhelming force. The air crackled with energy, the darkness around her pressing in on all sides. She could feel the weight of the book in the figure's hands, its pages moving as if alive, its ancient words written in a language she couldn't understand. But she could feel their power, their pull. The figure tilted its head slowly, watching her with unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. "You've come far, Kayla, farther than most. But this is where the journey ends, or where it begins anew. The house will claim you either way." "Why me?" Kayla whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. The words were out before she could stop them, the question that had been gnawing at her ever since she stepped foot on Hollowbrook Road. Why have I been brought here? The figure's lips twisted into something like a smile, but it was a smile of pure malice. Because you are the last. You are the descendant of those who once built this house. Your blood runs through its very walls. Hollowbrook was always waiting for you to return, to finish what was started. Kayla's mind reeled as the realization crashed over her. What do you mean? My blood? The figure raised the book and a gust of wind whipped through the tunnel, the darkness swirling as if alive. The pages turned slowly, each one making a sound like the rustle of dry leaves. It spoke again, its voice a soft murmur, almost lost in the wind. The house was built by your ancestors, those who sought power beyond death, power through ritual. They gave themselves to the house and it consumed them, but one among them, one who carried the blood of the first to enter this place, would be the one to complete the cycle. You were always meant to be here, Kayla. Kayla felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through her limbs. Her ancestors had built this place. She had read about Hollowbrook, about the disappearances, the strange happenings in the village. But she never thought it would be tied to her own bloodline. No, I didn't ask for this, she gasped, stepping back. The tunnel seemed to close in on her with each passing moment, the figure's words pushing her further into a corner. I don't want any part of it. The figure's voice deepened, and for a moment it almost seemed to echo with the voices of the many souls trapped in the house. You've already made your choice, Kayla. The moment you crossed the threshold, you sealed your fate. You are the last piece. The ritual must be completed. Before Kayla could protest, the figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. A low rumble shook the tunnel, the stone walls groaning as if in pain. The book flipped open to a page covered in strange symbols, runes that seemed to pulse with dark energy. Kayla could feel the pressure building, the pull of the ritual wrapping around her like chains. She fought against it, but the weight of the house was too much, too powerful. It was in her blood now. The darkness had already claimed her, whether she wanted it or not. You will join us, Kayla, the figure said softly, its voice now almost a lullaby. Join the others. Join the house. The world around Kayla seemed to blur, the darkness thickening as the figure's words echoed in her mind. She tried to breathe, but the air was too thin, too oppressive. Panic rose in her chest like a tidal wave, threatening to drown her. She turned her head, desperate for something, anything to save her from this fate. She glanced behind her, but the tunnel had already begun to close, the walls contracting with a grinding sound that sent a wave of dread through her. The way back was gone. There was no escape. But then she saw something that froze her blood. A faint light far down the corridor. A flicker, a promise of salvation, or so it seemed. Kayla's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? The light shimmered, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. She had no time to think. Instincts took over and she ran, her feet pounding against the cold stone, faster and faster as if something were chasing her. The figure's laughter followed her. You cannot escape. You cannot outrun what is in your blood. Kayla reached the light just as the house seemed to close in on her, trapping her in its suffocating grip. She reached out, hoping for a door, a window, an exit of some kind. But when her hands touched the light, it felt wrong. It was warm, but the warmth was burning, scalding her fingertips. She screamed, pulling her hand back, but the light remained, pulsing in time with her frantic heartbeat. And then, as if the house itself had heard her plea, it shifted. The light dimmed, and the stone walls of the tunnel began to crack. Beneath her feet, she felt the earth shift and tremble. A deep, resonating sound filled the air, as though something was breaking, something ancient, something powerful. The light flickered once more before it collapsed into darkness. And then, there was silence. Kayla's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood in the now empty corridor, her eyes wide with shock. The creature, the figure, it was gone. The walls had stopped moving. The book, the ritual. Everything was still. For a brief moment, Kayla thought she had escaped, thought she had beaten the house at its own game. But then, as she stood alone in the dark, she felt it, a presence. Cold fingers brushed against her shoulder. She spun around. A figure stood there, tall and cloaked in darkness. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed with a faint, unearthly light. "You cannot outrun destiny, Kayla," the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. She froze. It was the same figure, but different. The power it held now was unlike anything she had felt before. This time there was no ritual, no book. Only the weight of the house, pulling her in, claiming her. Kayla's body trembled as the realization hit her. The house wasn't just a place. It was a force, an ancient evil that thrived on fear, on power, on souls, and it would never let her go. Kayla had reached the point of no return. The house, in its twisted hunger, had broken her spirit and swallowed her whole. Her bloodline, her fate, had been intertwined with Hollowbrook House long before she ever arrived. The ritual had been a mere illusion. The house itself had chosen her, and now she belonged to it. But in the stillness of the dark, something unexpected happened. The figure, the creature that had haunted her, shifted, its form trembling as if it were beginning to dissolve. Kayla watched in horror as it began to fade, the very darkness around it starting to unravel. Why are you leaving?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a cold, empty void. Kayla stood alone in the tunnel, her mind numb with disbelief. The house was silent now, almost as if it were waiting. For a moment she thought she could hear the faintest sound, a whisper, perhaps a sigh. And in that moment, Kayla understood. She wasn't free. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. But now she was no longer just a part of it. She was its keeper. And Hollowbrook would wait, silently, for the next soul to wander into its grasp. Kayla's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what had just happened. The oppressive weight of Hollowbrook's power crushed her every breath. The air felt thicker now, colder, as though the house was observing her every move. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, coiling around her like a living entity. Her mind reeled. She had always known something was off about this place, but she hadn't understood just how deeply intertwined it was with her. Her bloodline had been destined for Hollowbrook's grasp. She had never stood a chance. The ground beneath her feet groaned, a low, guttural rumble that felt like the house itself was coming to life. The walls closed in on her again, the endless corridors twisting and turning in impossible directions. She began to move almost instinctively, her legs carrying her forward despite the fear paralyzing her. Every step she took felt like a surrender, but there was nowhere else to go. She was trapped in a living nightmare. Kayla stumbled into a vast room that seemed to stretch beyond her vision. The ceiling was impossibly high, the walls lined with ancient tapestries that flickered with fleeting, distorted images. Faces of long-dead souls stared back at her, their eyes wide and pleading, as if they too had once been where she was now, helpless, lost in Hollowbrook's clutches. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it. At the center of the room on a raised dais lay the remains of what could only be described as a throne made of bones, flesh, and fragments of shattered glass. A terrible ancient chair that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Kayla's feet moved toward it against her will, her body drawn like a moth to a flame. She had no choice. It was as if the house itself was guiding her, pulling her toward it. As she approached, she felt a strange sensation, a tugging, pulling force at the very core of her being. The throne beckoned her, its shape forming into something more than just a seat. It was a symbol of power. Power she now possessed. Power she didn't want. Before she could stop herself, she found her body sitting in the throne. The moment she touched it, a wave of icy coldness surged through her. The room began to shift, the walls distorting and warping around her as if the house was alive, reconfiguring itself to accommodate her presence. In the blink of an eye, she was no longer in the room. The world around her had collapsed into pure darkness, and for the briefest moment, she felt weightless as if she had fallen into some kind of abyss. But the darkness didn't last. Suddenly, light, dim, flickering light, poured into the void. It wasn't real light. It didn't belong to the world she knew. The light was wrong, pale and ghostly, casting long, twisted shadows across a desolate landscape. It was a place that didn't exist, a place that had never existed, a place between worlds. Kayla, a voice whispered, soft but unmistakable. She turned, her heart racing as she scanned the unfamiliar landscape. Shadows moved in the distance, and the cold, unnatural light cast long, grotesque silhouettes. The ground beneath her feet was slick, blackened, as if something vile had seeped into it. "Kayla," the voice came again, this time closer. It was the voice of a woman, familiar yet distant. She couldn't place it, but it resonated deep within her, stirring memories she hadn't known she had. Memories of the house, memories of the woman who had stood before her, her face pale and sorrowful. The figure emerged from the shadows, stepping forward with deliberate slowness. Her face, once blurry, now sharpened into something both beautiful and horrifying, her skin translucent, her eyes black as coal. The same woman from the mirrors. Kayla gasped. You're the one from the mirrors." The woman's lips curved into a sad smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, I was. But I was also someone else. Someone who was like you. Once." Kayla's throat tightened. "What do you want from me?" The woman's gaze flickered to the throne. Her expression darkened. "I am what you will become if you do not leave now." Kayla's mind raced, the woman's words echoing in her skull. Leave now? Where could she go? There was no escape. The house had already claimed her, made her part of its very being. What choice did she have? "You cannot run from this, Kayla. You are its keeper now," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a weight of finality. Kayla clenched her fists. "No, I won't let it be true. I can't." "You already have." The woman's eyes gleamed and the air around them grew colder. "You are bound to the house, just as I was bound before you." Kayla stood frozen in place as the woman slowly walked toward her, her feet barely touching the ground. "I was a child just like you, a child who thought she could escape. But now I am the one who holds the house's power. I rule here." She gestured to the twisted landscape, the shifting shadows and the distorted architecture. "But it's not freedom. It's a curse." Kayla swallowed hard. The woman's words pierced her heart like a dagger. She felt the weight of what she was becoming settle on her shoulders like a cold, suffocating cloak. "This is what happens when you are consumed by the house, Kayla," the woman whispered. "You will take my place. You will be its keeper, just as I was before you. The house feeds on your fear. It lives in your blood. And in the end, it consumes all." Suddenly the darkness shifted again, and the air around Kayla began to crackle with energy. She felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Something was coming, something terrible. "Don't you see?" the woman continued, her voice growing fainter. "There is no escape. There is only the house. Only Hollowbrook." Kayla's vision blurred as the air thickened with the stench of decay, and she realized with a sickening feeling that the shadows around her weren't just shadows. They were souls, hundreds of them, all trapped in the dark recesses of the house, waiting, whispering, calling. "Kayla," the voices cried in unison. Her breath caught in her throat. "No. No, please." But it was too late. The house was calling her, claiming her, pulling her into its endless web of torment. She was bound to it now, just as the woman had been bound before her. And there was no escape. The woman's form dissolved into the shadows, leaving Kayla standing alone in the dark. But she wasn't alone. The voices of the lost souls echoed in her ears, whispering her name, begging her for release. Kayla's body trembled and the weight of Hollowbrook's power pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. In the distance, she saw the throne again, but this time, it wasn't empty. Someone sat there, their face obscured by shadow, The throne, like an anchor, was pulling her toward it. Her heart pounded in her chest as the truth became clear. She was trapped, caught in the endless cycle of Hollowbrook's hunger. There was no way out. She would never be free. And as she walked toward the throne, her footsteps silent in the darkness, she knew that soon she would join the others. Soon she would become another lost soul within the house. Hollowbrook had claimed another, and the cycle would begin again. The house hummed around her, its ancient, malevolent presence pulsing like a heartbeat, a sound that reverberated through the stone beneath her feet. Kayla's body trembled, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts of escape, of breaking free from this nightmare. The weight of the throne's power pressed down on her, but she couldn't let it claim her. She couldn't be like the others. She couldn't let the house win. Her eyes darted across the shifting landscape, the endless hallways, the distorting architecture, the souls of the lost, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in eternal screams, stared at her from the walls. They too had been consumed by Hollowbrook, and now their souls were bound to the house, feeding it, giving it strength. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle. Kayla clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The memories of the woman, the last keeper, flashed before her. She had spoken of escape, of freedom, of the endless torment of being bound to the house. But she had given up. She had let the house claim her. Kayla wouldn't make that same mistake. As her mind raced, a thought occurred to her. One fleeting moment of clarity. She remembered the books she had found earlier in the library, the texts filled with forbidden knowledge, rituals, and dark secrets. What if there was something in them, some way to undo the curse, to sever the connection between herself and the house? She had to try. Kayla turned on her heel and sprinted down the winding corridors, her breath coming in quick gasps as she moved through the shifting maze of Hollowbrook. The walls twisted and distorted, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Each step was a battle, but she pushed forward, driven by the hope that there might still be a way to escape. Kayla's footsteps echoed through the halls of the house, the silence around her thick and oppressive. It felt as though Hollowbrook was watching her every move, waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to succumb to its power. But she refused to give in. She reached the library again, the large wooden doors creaking as she pushed them open. The familiar scent of dust and old paper filled the air, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker. She knew the house had been waiting for her here, and that made her even more determined to find what she needed. Her eyes scanned the shelves, the massive collection of forbidden books stretching in every direction. She had to find the one that would give her the knowledge to break the curse. She couldn't trust the house, couldn't trust the whispers of the souls that haunted it. But the books might hold the key. Kayla rushed to the far corner of the library, her heart pounding in her chest as her hands skimmed the spines of the ancient tomes. Finally, her fingers brushed against something cold, something different. A thick leather-bound volume that was older than the others. The edges of the pages were yellowed and brittle, and the cover was embossed with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. She pulled the book from the shelf and opened it carefully, the pages crackling under her touch. The words were written in a language she didn't understand, but something about the symbols, the way they twisted and writhed on the page, felt familiar. It was as though the book itself recognized her touch. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the ancient script until she found what she was looking for. A ritual that spoke of binding, of severing ties with the house, a ritual that could break the cycle. But there was a cost. Kayla's breath caught in her throat as she read the final lines of the ritual. To sever the bond with the house, to break free from its grasp, the soul must be offered in exchange. The price of freedom is one life for the souls of many. Kayla closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over her. She had come to Hollowbrook seeking answers, seeking an escape. But what if the price of that escape was too high? Should she sacrifice herself to save the others? Her mind raced as she considered the consequences. If she performed the ritual, she could free herself, escape the house's grip. But the price was steep. The house demanded a soul, one life in exchange for freedom. her own life. Kayla stood in the library, the weight of the book in her hands, and the choice pressing down on her like a physical burden. The house whispered around her, the voices of the lost souls rising in an eerie chorus. "You cannot escape. You belong to us." But Kayla had already made her decision. She wasn't going to let Hollowbrook win. She wasn't going to let the house consume her like it had consumed so many others. She was going to break the cycle. She knew what she had to do. Without hesitation, she closed the book and turned toward the door. The house felt different now, the air colder, heavier, as though it knew what she was about to do. As she stepped back into the darkened corridors, she could feel the house shifting, reacting to her presence. Kayla moved quickly, her heart racing as she retraced her steps toward the throne. The throne where she had almost given in, where she had almost become one of the lost souls, but now she had a plan. As she approached the dais, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the air thickening around her. The house wasn't going to make it easy. It was going to fight her every step of the way, but she was ready. Kayla stood before the throne, the book clutched tightly in her hands. The ritual had to be performed here, in the heart of the house, where the power was strongest. She placed the book on the ground, her hands trembling as she began to speak the ancient words written within. The air around her crackled with energy, and the house seemed to groan, as though it were alive, aware of her defiance. The ground beneath her feet shook as if the house itself were trying to stop her, trying to pull her back into its grasp. But Kayla pressed on, her voice steady as she recited the final incantation. The words filled the room, resonating with an otherworldly power. The shadows around her twisted and writhed, and for a moment she felt a burning pain in her chest, as though the house were reaching out to take her. Then, with a final, thunderous roar, the power of the house surged and the room erupted in a blinding light. For a moment everything was still. Then, the light faded, and the world around Kayla came into focus. She was no longer in the throne room, no longer standing in Hollowbrook's cursed halls. The oppressive darkness had lifted. The voices of the lost souls were gone. She was free. Kayla collapsed to her knees, exhaustion washing over her. The pain of the ritual lingered, but it was nothing compared to the weight that had been lifted from her soul. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. But even as she knelt there, catching her breath, she knew that Hollowbrook had not been truly defeated. It was still out there, waiting for the next soul to enter its grasp. For now, Kayla had escaped, but the house would always hunger for more. Kayla sat on the cold, barren ground, her breath shallow as she surveyed the world around her. The house had released its hold on her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. She had severed the ties that bound her to Hollowbrook. But the question remained. What now? What would she do with her newfound freedom? The sky above her was gray, lifeless, as if it too were waiting for something. For the first time since she had entered the house, there was no oppressive weight hanging over her, no shadows lurking at the edges of her vision. She was alone. As she slowly stood, her legs trembling beneath her, she realized that the house, the cursed Hollowbrook House, was gone. There were no more whispers, no more voices calling her name. The air felt clean, the ground solid beneath her feet. But something still felt off. Kayla closed her eyes, willing herself to make sense of it all. She had broken the cycle, she had escaped the curse, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Hollowbrook wasn't done with her. Not really. She turned toward the horizon, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The journey ahead would not be easy. She had freed herself, but the house's power still lingered in her mind like a haunting memory. The ritual had taken a toll on her very soul. And though she was no longer physically bound to the house, there was a part of her that still felt connected, as though the house was a part of her and she a part of it. Her eyes fell on the ground where she stood. Beneath her feet, the earth shifted, subtly, like the slow pulse of a living being. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. The earth wasn't just ground, it was something more. Hollowbrook's influence still touched the world beyond its walls. As Kayla walked further away from the place she had come to know as Hollowbrook, she began to realize the truth. The house had not been a physical structure alone. It was a force, an ancient, malignant presence that could not simply be destroyed. Hollowbrook was rooted deep in the earth, bound to the very fabric of reality itself. In the distance, the remnants of the house flickered before her eyes. Like a mirage, it appeared and vanished in the span of a breath. She rubbed her eyes, unsure of whether the house was truly gone or if it was still watching her from the corners of her perception. Then it came to her. Hollowbrook wasn't just a place. It was a curse. It could never truly be destroyed. It existed in every soul it had consumed, in every fragment of its history. It had taken so many before her, and now it was a part of her, part of the world. She understood now that the ritual hadn't just broken the bond between her and the house. It had severed her from the rest of the world. She had escaped its physical grasp, but Hollowbrook had left its mark on her, its hunger deep in her veins, and there was no undoing that. She could never truly escape. The house had changed her, and it would always be with her. Days passed in a blur. Kayla tried to move on. She tried to return to some semblance of a normal life. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the house. Its dark halls, its twisted corridors, the faces of the lost souls that had been consumed by its hunger. She had thought that by breaking the ritual, by escaping, she would be free. But freedom was an illusion. The house had touched her soul. It had left its imprint, and now there was no going back. In her dreams, she wandered the empty halls of Hollowbrook once again, the walls alive with the whispers of the souls it had claimed. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, only to find herself alone in her room, surrounded by the silence of her own thoughts. But one night, as she lay awake in her bed, she heard it. A whisper. Kayla. Her heart pounded in her chest. She turned her head toward the window, the shadows outside seemingly shifting with the wind. Kayla. Come back. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. She shook her head, closing her eyes, willing the sound away. But it came again, stronger this time. It's not over. She shot out of bed, panic rising in her throat. She looked around her room, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The house was calling her, pulling her back. Her blood ran cold. By the time Kayla reached the edge of the forest, she already knew what she had to do. The whispering voice had been clear. Hollowbrook was never truly gone. The house was alive, and it would always hunger for more. But what had once been Hollowbrook was no longer just a place. It was a curse, a malignant force that could never be erased. The house had always been waiting for her, even after she thought she had escaped. The only thing that had changed was the shape it had taken. Now, Hollowbrook was everywhere. It had become part of her, part of the world. Kayla's footsteps were heavy as she walked toward the place where the house had once stood. The ground beneath her feet trembled as though it recognized her approach. The earth groaned, and the trees seemed to bend in on themselves as if the world were conspiring to bring her back. She had been free, briefly. But in the end, freedom was just a fleeting dream. Hollowbrook had already won. The house rose from the earth before her like a specter coming back to life. It had never truly disappeared. It had always existed, waiting for the right moment to return. The walls seemed to shimmer and warp, reshaping themselves as they had before. The twisted doors creaked open, welcoming her back into its embrace. Kayla's mind screamed in protest, but her body moved forward, drawn to the darkness. She knew there was no escaping it. The cycle was eternal. She stepped through the threshold of Hollowbrook House, the door slamming shut behind her with a deafening crash. The shadows enveloped her, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. She was home. But now there was no more running, no more escape. Kayla had become Hollowbrook, and Hollowbrook had become her. The curse would live on through her. She would be the keeper, the final soul bound to the house. And as the house closed around her, she understood the true horror. It was not the house that had consumed them all. It was the house that had always been inside them. The cycle continues. Hollowbrook House has found its keeper, but as it always does, it waits for the next soul to cross its path. The house will never truly rest. It lives in every one of us, a hunger that never ceases. And when the next wanderer arrives, Hollowbrook will be ready.